You'd think the relationship between the US and Europe on Iran would be pretty straightforward, right? Well, it's anything but. In this explainer, we're going to dig into historian Victor Davis Hanson's pretty provocative argument that Europe's foreign policy is stuck in a really deep and, frankly, revealing contradiction.
So Hansen just throws this question right out there. He's pointing to a puzzle. Why are the US and Europe, who are supposed to be aligned Western powers, so divided on a threat that, he argues, is common to both of them? And this question, well, it leads him to a pretty startling diagnosis. And that brings us to the core of his whole argument, a really strong metaphor he calls European schizophrenia. The idea is this. Europe, he says, wants it both ways. It wants the security that comes from U.S. protection against threats like a nuclear Iran, but at the very same time, it wants to dodge the costs and the messy moral questions that come with getting directly involved. Okay, so where does Hansen actually see this pattern playing out? He argues this isn't just a one-off thing, but a consistent behavior. He points to several specific examples as evidence for this reluctance, starting with a really critical airbase. First up, the Diego Garcia Air Base. This one's critical. He highlights how the British, a key U.S. ally, at first put limits on the U.S., reportedly saying its bombers could only be used for defensive purposes against Iran. Now, that might sound like a subtle detail, but in military terms, that's a huge distinction. And it wasn't just an isolated case. His argument continues with Spain, where he says the U.S. was told it couldn't use the NATO base there at all for any actions related to Iran. So each example adds another layer to his argument that there's this continent-wide hesitation. And finally, let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz. I mean, we're talking about one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. He points to the moment the U.S. asked for help patrolling these waters to protect the very flow of oil that Europe itself depends on, and major powers like France and Germany were, he says, reluctant to commit their own ships.
So the big question is, why? If this pattern of reluctance is real, what's causing it? This is where Hansen's argument shifts from just observing the behavior to diagnosing the root cause. He argues that Europe's foreign policy isn't some accident. It's the direct result of 5 major, self-inflicted internal crises.
And here they are, the 5 root causes he identifies. Each one is a crisis on its own, but he argues they're all deeply connected, feeding into each other. First, he points to mass immigration without assimilation, which he says makes political leaders fearful. Second, green energy policies that have created a dangerous dependency on places like Russia. Third, post-Cold War disarmament, which left many nations unable to project power. And finally, he combines low fertility rates and strained social safety nets, which he believes are weakening the continent from the inside out and pulling resources away from defense.
Just to give you a sense of what he's talking about with that demographic point, he cites fertility rates as low as 1.3 in some countries. Now, you need a rate of 2.1 just to keep your population stable. So for Hansen, this isn't just a number. It's a sign of a society that's maybe losing a bit of confidence in its own future.
Okay, this brings us to the real climax of his argument. The huge contrast between what European leaders apparently say in public versus what they ask the U.S. for behind closed doors. This is the very essence of that schizophrenia he's describing.
And this is where that contradiction becomes crystal clear. Hansen alleges that the public language is all cautious diplomacy, words like disturbing and dangerous. But privately, he claims the tone shifts completely to these desperate pleas for American action. What are you going to do? Or, please, Mr. President. In his view, this massive gap between the public stance and the private reality is what defines the entire relationship.
So all of this builds to what Hansen sees as the final, tragic irony of the whole situation. See, his argument isn't that this is a story about a continent that can't act, but about one that chooses not to.
First, he says, just look at the population, around 450 million people. That's significantly more than the United States. The raw human capital to be a global power is absolutely there.
And it's not just about people. Economically, Europe's combined GDP is right up there with China's. The resources and the financial muscle are all in place. The potential for Europe to be a superpower on its own terms is just immense.
So for Hansen, this is the conclusion. It's a situation he describes as both tragic and pathetic. He sees a powerful entity with enormous resources that, in his analysis, chooses dependency. And this choice allows it to have its security guaranteed by an outside power while also keeping the right to criticize that very same power.
So, we're left with a pretty critical question. What does an analysis like this mean for the future of the West? Is Europe destined to stay a dependent partner, criticizing the very power it relies on?
Or could these internal pressures actually force a huge shift, maybe turning a historic ally into something else entirely? It's a question that really cuts to the core of Western security.